Dark Souls 2 is underrated. Well, let's see what he has to say. Let's see what he has to say on the topic. Using the binoculars in Majula.
Hey.
Hi there.
I'm not sure how to say this without making someone out there really mad, but
Say it.
I don't really care, so here goes. I like Dark Souls 2.
Those words, just how you trigger any Souls fan. Although, I personally do think the game is underrated to an extent, but let's see what he has to say. I'm curious. His video is 17 minutes long. I'm curious to see what he says on the subject matter.
There, I said it. I really like Dark Souls 2. Okay, I understand that liking Dark Souls 2 isn't exactly the most controversial thing in the world, especially considering the large...
No, I think it is still controversial. Like, I know that there's a lot of videos that have come out, you know, IGN reviewed the game, but, you know, IGN's kind of trash. You have, like, in defense of Dark Souls 2. But a lot of these videos do tend to not address some of the glaring issues the game has.
Large number of other videos.
So I'm kind of interested to see what this guy will say.
I believe it needs to be said that Dark Souls 2 is underrated. Dark Souls 2 is actually one of my...
I don't think Dark Souls 2 is underrated. I think that most of the criticism towards it is justified. Like, there is a lot of bad things about Dark Souls 2. And objectively speaking, it's one of the worst Souls games. But it's still a good game.
More favorite Souls games, so it is understandably pretty upsetting to me to see this game being trashed on so often. The negative discussion surrounding it has caused for people to avoid playing it altogether, and I think a lot of the hate for Dark Souls 2 is undeserved. But of course that doesn't mean that some things aren't deserved.
Bro, this area. The Shrine of Armana is such a dogshit area. Like, this game has some very good areas, I won't lie. But holy shit, Dark Souls 2 has some dog shit areas, and this is one of them. Like, imagine, how does this sound? You're in a massive open area, waist deep in water that slows you down. The enemies aren't slowed down, and there's also, like, lock-on magic users that their spells just track onto you. Does that sound fun?
The main goal of this video is to highlight the positives of Dark Souls 2, but I will mention some of the things that I think drag the game down. I'm going to do this mainly because I don't feel like the negatives should be ignored. They do hold weight on the overall quality of the game itself, so ignoring them, in my opinion, would be in bad taste.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It would just be bias if you ignored the bad stuff.
A lot of what I will be saying in this video will be solely my opinion, so take of it what you will. It
Subjective.
is always good to develop your own opinions, so if you watch this video and are interested in Dark Souls 2, then go ahead and try it out. It's honestly a good game, and it's worth diving into if you've played the other games in the series.
I think it's worth trying, but whether you'll go back and replay it is another matter.
Even if this one ends up being the last one you do play.
Dark Souls 2 is criminally underrated. I don't know if it is, but we'll see.
Now, with all of that being said, let's get into this. The first things I want to discuss about Dark Souls 2 are the game's mechanics.
Okay.
Many of the mechanics of Dark Souls 2 are unique to the game, and only a couple got picked back up with Elden Ring.
True. However, that is one thing that I want to go back to. I think, especially when Dark Souls 3 came along, there was a lot of people that made the defense of Dark Souls 2's mechanics, saying like, oh, well, Dark Souls 2's mechanics returned in Dark Souls 3. But when you actually compare the mechanics that returned versus those that were dropped, there was like 5 that were brought into Dark Souls 3 and like 40 that were dropped. So take from that what you will. I do think that the Stone Sword lock keys in, or whatever they're called, the Stone Sword keys in Elden Ring were a good idea. And I think that they were handled better. I do think they were a good addition.
Elden Ring. There is one specific mechanic, though, that didn't make it into Elden Ring. Well, actually, the mechanic is more of an item, and that item is the bonfire aesthetic. I already made a short about the bonfire aesthetic, where I rather embarrassingly called it the bonfire aesthetic.
This item's amazing.
To summarize that short, the bonfire aesthetics are the only item in the Dark Souls series to directly affect the new game cycle.
Agreed.
This makes it, at least in my opinion, the most unique item in the entire series. You
possibly, yeah.
Bonfires, and doing so causes the area near that bonfire to go up one new game level. This cannot be undone and even persists through normal new game cycles. If you burn an aesthetic, the area you turn into New Game Plus will become New Game Plus 2 when you start New Game Plus. This is actually really cool because it adds extra weight to this decision you've made and forces you to think about whether or not it's actually worth it to burn the aesthetic.
Yeah, agreed. Especially because, like, some of the best gear in the game can only be received in New Game Plus. So you might be there thinking, oh, well, do I wait until New Game Plus to get this to get the equipment? Or do I say, fuck it, and use a bonfire aesthetic to make the area harder to get the better equipment now, but when you go into New Game Plus, that area will be even harder. Again, one thing that I like about the Souls games is pros and cons. You got to balance the pros and the cons, and I like that it gives you that option. Because the items are 100% optional. Like, you can beat the game without using a single bonfire aesthetic. And to be fair, they're not even that rare, you know. I mean, in the start of the game, they are quite rare, but once you get into, like, the mid and late game, you can theoretically have an infinite supply of these when you farm the Giant Lord for souls. So I think they're a good item.
Like the item is rare or precious, it's actually quite dangerous and should be treated as such.
Yeah.
There's obviously some places in the game where it's safer to use an aesthetic, but all in all, it's a really cool item, and honestly is my favorite part of Dark Souls 2.
I like that his character is like the Joker. I like that.
The way Dark Souls 2 handles New Game Plus is also one of the biggest positives I know about the game. It is the only game in the series that I feel does New Game Plus right. It isn't just a harder challenge with enemies having higher damage and health, it's also a partially new experience with...
That is something that I do really wish was brought back in other games. Like, replaying the game does get a little bit boring when you know where everything is. So, like, for example, in New Game Plus, chances are there's no reason to... Like, using Elden Ring as an example, there's no reason to, like, explore stuff if you know for a fact that you aren't going to benefit from what that specific dungeon or area has to provide. So, like, once you've already got, like, maxed out stats, you've got the best armor in the game, you've got, like, 10 weapons that are all maxed out, you love them, they're all balanced, etc. There's not really any incentive to explore at that point. So I think that fundamentally changing the game, even slightly, by, like, adding new enemies, like, taking some enemies out, adding new items, that alone would give the game so much more replay value. Dark Souls 2 does this, however, I don't think it does it all that well. Like, a lot of the times, it's just, like, these NPC invader type people. I think that it could have been way cooler if, say, for example, this area in particular, if they added, like, more spiders, as it's, like, the spider zone. You know, I think that that would have been really cool and would have been a bit more immersive.
New items and enemy placements. There's a full list of changes on the wiki for the game, so go check that out for more information. My favorite changes to the game are an additional counter with the Duke's Tier Freya.
Yeah, like, this is what I mean. This is what I mean. This is probably the most substantial change, where this guy is, like, the big boss of the area, just this big fuck-off giant spider. And in New Game Plus, it will literally pursue you throughout the level. Like, you'll encounter it here before you even get to the area where you fight this guy in. And I'm fairly sure you fight him a second time before the boss itself. Not to mention something that's really cool, you can damage him here in this encounter, and he will stay damaged when you actually go on to fight him, which I think is really cool.
Enemy encounters, including a new encounter with the Pursuer in Drangleic Castle. Dark Souls 2 really puts into perspective.
And again, I think that the Pursuer encounter in the Drangleic Castle, that makes sense, because he's literally the Pursuer. You encounter him at multiple stages in the game. You know, you fight him for real in the Forest of the Fallen Giants, but then you encounter him in the Lost Bastille, you encounter him in Iron Keep, and then in New Game Plus, you encounter him in Drangleic Castle. I think it's so that is a good example of, you know, changing things up, because it adds to the immersion and it doesn't break it.
Plus could be, and what really it should be. I personally believe the most replayable Dark Souls is Dark Souls 3, simply because of how fast you can burn through it on a second run. The bosses really carry that too, each one being an amazing stop on an otherwise speedy run through the game. But
yeah, I can kind of agree with that. Is Dark Souls 3 the most replayable? I honestly don't agree with that. I mean, I don't like Dark Souls 3 as much as other people. I don't know. I think the Souls game that is the most replayable is probably Elden Ring. Just because of the incredible amount of shit that you can do in that game. As well as the fact that you have essentially, like, infinite possibilities on what you can do in terms of, like, the direction that you approach it. I mean, you know me. I think Elden Ring and Dark Souls 1 are the best games to start off with. And I think that they're very replayable.
Just think about how much better that could have been if there were more substantial and effective changes to the game that built up over the cycles until they capped at New Game 7. It would make the journey through the difficulty of New Game Plus that much more worth it if there were new encounters to fight through on each subsequent playthrough. Dark Souls 2 really had its heart in the right place with its focus on the cycle, and that is something...
This boss is one of the coolest fights in the game. The Looking Glass Knight is easily, like, in the base game, this guy is a top 3 boss fight. Easily. Like, fighting him on the roof of this massive castle whilst it's raining in the middle of a storm. It's amazing.
Dark Souls 2 doesn't do New Game Plus the way I'm really describing, but at least it somewhat does it justice. Now, the one thing I will say...
Yeah, like, he even admitted it there. Like, Dark Souls 2, it's a step in the right direction, but it's not perfect. Like, they could have done so much more with, like, the adding, you know, different enemies, different items, etc. It's a bit inconsistent. And the way that it does happen does break immersion. Like, adding, like, NPC, just random NPC invader types. I just think that that's not a good idea. I think that they should add, like, more, like in the Hyde's Tower of Flame, for example, add more Hyde Knights. Like, that makes sense, you know?
That does drag the experience down in New Game Plus is that even though some encounters are adjusted, they still feel extremely ganky and unfun to deal with.
Oh, absolutely. Like, look at that. That is a perfect example. Go back to that. Where is it?
Ganky.
So, he's already been chased by, like, 2 enemies that offer a challenge in a 1v1 fight. There's a 3rd one here, okay?
Fun to deal with in some situations.
Look, there's a 4th NPC invader, and then there's a fucking dragon. Like, you cannot, like, that would have the potential to go... I mean, granted, he's already lowered the bridge, but you can see easily how fast this entire encounter would go tits up.
Hyde's Tower of Flame specifically comes to mind, although this is strictly an issue with Scholar of the First Sin Edition. The Hyde Knights are already a little much for the area after...
Like, look at that. In Elden Ring, the dragon would do so much damage to these guys. But if I just replay that, the fire barely scratches them. Like, look at that. Meanwhile, it messes you up. Look at how many fucking enemies there are! What the fuck? Hold on.
The Hyde Knights are already a little much.
Look at them. What the fuck is going on here?
Combined with the extra old...
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7... plus the dragon.
New Game Plus, it makes for an
what the fuck is going on?
Well, fun. That is an issue that is sadly all too common in Scholar of the First Sin Edition. Enemy placement just feels...
Okay, I will say, I think Dark Souls 2 Scholar of the First Sin, that is the version I played, and I didn't beat the original Dark Souls 2. So, for me, apparently Dark Souls 2 Scholar is worse in its enemy placements. However, for me, they are the norm, if that makes sense.
Feels off in
like, again, what the fuck is going on here? You've got, like, 2 of the Ironclad bros. Good luck taking them on in a 2v1 because of how much poise they have. You have these 2 Alon Knights, which are fast as shit. And you have a 5th one over there as well.
With the enemy placement in Scholar,
also, in Dark Souls 2, you cannot go through fog walls if an enemy interrupts you. You'll just get stunned. Like, in every other Souls game, you have, as soon as you start going through a fog wall, you're invincible. The enemies can't touch you. Dark Souls 2, nope. If there's an enemy nearby, you ain't going through that fog wall, boy. So essentially, he has to kill all fucking 5 of these guys in order to progress with the game.
For a lot of us, it was something that really just hampered the experience. And that is possibly one of the worst things about Scholar. It teaches people to run past enemies rather than fight them one by one. The vanilla version of Dark Souls...
I think I disagree with that, because in his footage, running past the enemies is clearly the wrong thing to do. Because these guys will track you like a freaking Russian submarine. You know what I mean? Like, running past these guys is not an option. Fighting them is the better choice.
2 doesn't have this issue as much and is by far a more enjoyable experience with enemy placement.
Now we're going on
while
to the bosses.
enemies of Dark Souls 2 are somewhat lackluster, the bosses are anything but that.
Yeah, I don't agree with that. I think Dark Souls 2 boss fights, I'm not too sure if he's going to be talking about the DLCs, but like the bosses for the most part in Dark Souls 2 are terrible. They go for quantity over quality and it just doesn't work. And I know that Elden Ring does that as well, but Elden Ring's boss quality overall, even for the weaker fights, are like so much better. It's night and day. Like, look at this boss fight as a good example. It's literally just a room full of enemies. And like, not even any good enemies, no, it's just a room full of these random hollows that are like the easiest enemies to kill in the game. Let's go back as well.
The bosses are anything but that.
This motherfucker is literally the same fucking dragon you find in Hyde's Tower of Flame, reused as a boss. This Royal Rat Authority, even though he's more of a dog, is just a shit version of Sif from Dark Souls 1. We already discussed the Prowling Magus and the Congregation.
Okay, fine.
I don't think using the Rotten's a good example. I actually quite like the Rotten. I mean, he's basically just a shit version of Nito, but considering that I really like the Nito fight, I think the Rotten actually works pretty good. And in some ways, you could argue he's better than Nito, because he is a force of nature.
Alright, I get it. I
quite like him.
Okay, so some of the bosses aren't that good.
The Giant Lord. The Giant Lord is just the last giant, except he has a big-ass sword. And I get that from the lore, that makes sense, because the Giant Lord and the Last Giant are literally the same character. Just one's from the past, one's from the present. So from a lore standpoint, it makes sense, but from a gameplay,
and
nah.
One is considered.
Oh, and who can forget Jabba the Hutt? Who the fuck actually died to this guy? Can I be honest? Like, look at this abomination.
To be the worst in the series.
This guy is so easy. If anyone actually died to this guy, I'm...
By many. But there are a lot of amazing bosses.
Oh, and speaking of which as well, do you remember Ornstein and Smo from Dark Souls 1? Yeah, let's just get rid of Smo and reuse this guy. The only difference being is that we replace his lightning with some black magic. Genius. I mean, I don't hate it, because it's Ornstein. But again, it's just reusing stuff.
This is in Dark Souls 2. A good few of them, including my favorite boss in the whole entire game, are in the DLCs.
Yeah, I think, let me just go back to that.
Favorite boss in...
Yeah, the DLC does have quite good bosses for the most part. I'd say that every DLC package has one shit boss, but every DLC package has one amazing boss. And I think that the Iron King DLC has the best bosses. Like, you have the Blue Smelter Demon. I actually quite like fighting Smelter Demons. I think they're some of the coolest bosses in the game. You have Sir Alon, which is this guy here, another pretty good fight. And you have the Fume Knight, which is my personal favourite boss in the game. So yeah, the DLC and Dark Souls 2 as a whole have some good bosses, but overall,
in the whole entire
it's
game
not it, Chief.
Are in the DLCs of the game, which include some of the highest highs and the lowest lows of all of the Souls games.
Absolutely.
With 40...
It really is the case. Like, the DLCs, the highs are higher than the base game, but the lows are somehow lower than the base game. And the base game already has some of the worst lows in the series. It's crazy.
On bosses, at least a few are bound to be hits, which I will give...
Demon of Song is not a hit. This guy's hitboxes are shit. Not to mention, you have to get within range of his stupid-ass hitboxes because the rest of his body is invincible.
Dark Souls 2. It does have a lot of road bumps and clutter, but at least most of it is optional, and it's all fairly unique with the exception of a couple of bosses. Dark Souls 2's bosses have a lot going for them. Even lesser bosses like the Pursuer are significantly...
How the fuck do you say that the Demon of Song is a good boss and the Pursuer is a bad boss? The Pursuer is amazing. Like, yeah, he's reused, but it makes sense for him to be reused because he's literally chasing you. I really like the Pursuer. How can you say that he's a lesser boss?
Cooler than many of the other bosses in the series. The Pursuer itself has a unique attack. It's an attack that if you were hit by it...
Hold on, let me just rewind that in super slow motion, okay? Bear with me a second. Where was it? Nearly. Watch what happens, okay? The blade doesn't touch him.
Attack.
Wait for it.
It's an...
There he is. There's the blade.
Attack.
It literally teleports him over there. Dark Souls 2 hitboxes, everyone. I wonder if he's going to mention hitboxes. He hasn't mentioned ADP or hitboxes yet.
Attack that if you were hit by it allows the pursuer to use dark magic against you. An attack that changes the boss's moveset if it lands is...
Okay, that's not technically true. I think in the first encounter, it does allow him to use black magic, but in this encounter, he can use black magic against you regardless. I don't know if that's just a scholar thing, but...
one of the coolest things I've ever seen in the Soul series, and this belongs to...
But it is really cool how this guy mixes it up. Like, he has black magic, he has the sword, which glows blue when he's going to do the attack. He's cool.
Bosses from the game, which is amazing. The bosses also all have a unique design to them.
From Watcher and Defender, these guys do not have a unique design. It's just a shit version of Ornstein and Smo. Like, that's literally all it is. And to an extent, you could even argue that it's a shit version of the Godskin duo, because they literally resurrect each other. Holy shit.
Keeping to a very vibrant and well-shaped look that tends to match the area they inhabit. The bosses of Iron Keep both represent fire and have a twisted, demonic look to them that accents the keep itself.
Okay, I do agree with him in this sense. I think that the bosses do represent the areas that they're in very well. So, like, yeah, the Smelter Demon and the Old Iron King, granted the Old Iron King's pretty shit, and the Smelter Demon's pretty good, but one thing they both have in common is they represent the area very well. Like, the Duke's Freya for the spider area, I mean, it's literally a big fucking spider. The Lost Bastille, the main boss, is like a prisoner. That's quite cool. And when you go into the gutter, the main boss is an amalgamation of shit and dead bodies. So it makes sense, like, in that sense. It's tonally consistent, I suppose.
Castle cursed to sink further into itself due to its own immense weight, becoming further burned and gnarled as it is punished for its hubris. The bosses of the
Dark Souls 2 haters.
Gnarled as it is punished for its hubris.
I love
The
it.
bosses of the Lost Bastille and Sinner's Rise all represent it being a prison for the undead.
Yeah.
The Ruined Sentinels being guards of the prison, and the Lost Sinner being the prisoner being guarded.
Yeah, exactly.
Bosses
Literally what I just said. Like, it makes sense that in a prison, one of the bosses is the prison guards, and the main boss is, like, the main prisoner. Like, the Tai Lung of prisoners, you know?
Fought underground or in caves. The royal guards are all found in castles or defending the kingdom's royals. The green bosses are found in the green zone, and so on. Each of these bosses fits their area, and that even includes the weird ones like the...
Yeah, I think that the bosses fit the area, but the bosses themselves is quite underwhelming.
Congregation. Dark Souls 2's highlights all mostly have to do with the game's visual design. Each of the areas, like their bosses, are vibrant and shaped.
Like, you cannot tell me that this area is not beautiful. It is so beautiful, and I think it helped inspire Archdragon Peak and Crumbling Farum Azula from Elden Ring. Farum Azula probably more so, with all the dragons flying around. And then the massive dragon shrine with the ancient dragon. Like, this area is so beautiful.
Shapely. Even the most rigid area designs are pleasing to look at. There is a spectacular attention to detail in each of these areas. Some of my favorites being the ruins of the Forest of the Fallen Giants and the desolated Broom Tower. The Forest of the Fallen Giants being the ruins of a fortress in Drangleic, destroyed by the war between the Giants and King Vendrick, something that we get to see play before our very eyes later in the game.
I really like the forest. The Forest of the Fallen Giants is one of the coolest areas in the game. And it's such a shame because chances are it's usually one of the first few areas you'll go to.
Last great tower of the Iron King, built from the king's obsession with the strength of iron, brought to ruin by the immense greed of the old Iron King, forever stained with ash. Each of these areas has its purpose and its lore, and I haven't found a single one where I haven't enjoyed every second of study that I've put into them. One thing specifically that I love about Dark...
Do you enjoy... No, but what do you remember? do you remember studying the areas, or do you remember the pain, sweat, blood, and tears you experienced trying to go through the areas? Black Gulch, looking at you.
Dark Souls 2 is its presentation of its areas.
Like, again, considering that this game came out in 2014, with Dark Souls 2 Scholar coming out a year later in 2015, the same year as Bloodborne, I don't think the graphics are as good as Bloodborne, but, like, even so, like, this is very beautiful.
In many locations, you get a faraway view of the area you're heading to. This is something that the later games would do as well, but I feel is done exceptionally well in Dark Souls 2. When you enter the Huntsman's Copse, you get this full view of the undead purgatory before continuing through the area. The same is true when you enter the poison pools of the Earthen Peak.
I didn't even notice that. Yeah, he's 100% right. Whenever you enter an area, you see, like, the big part of the area before you even... Yeah, he's completely right. I didn't even notice that.
Far away, but not entirely out of reach. The only area I can really say doesn't do this and could benefit from including it would be the Iron Keep, considering how massive it's supposed to be. The way Dark Souls 2 presents its areas just feels incredibly memorable.
Like, you cannot... Like, I got goosebumps when I saw Dranglake Castle during the storm for the first time. It's so beautiful. And yes, the castle itself is nothing special, unfortunately. But, like, when you saw it, and it's, like, its stature for the first time, it was incredible.
Remember the entrances to most of the areas of the game just because of how well they present themselves. I am sure that everybody who has played Dark Souls 2 remembers going through the things betwixt.
Yeah.
Watching as the glow from the crack in the mountain grew brighter and brighter until you crossed through it and into Majula. The first time going through this was amazing, and
to this day, that's still an amazing transition. Like, when you go through, you know, this dark, dreary tutorial area, and then you emerge into the hub area of the game, and it's just sunny, the music is tranquil, it's just amazing.
I don't think I'll ever forget it. Walking into each of the DLCs had the same effect for me, with an added bonus for at least 2 of them where the kingdom is presented directly through this wide landscape shot, somewhat framed by things that are close by in the foreground.
Like, again, Frozen Elium Lois is regarded generally as one of the best areas in the game. Just look at this. It's like something out of, like, a Disney film. It's so good.
All of it feels very purposeful, like FromSoft really wanted you to get this idea of the lands you were setting foot in. I'm glad this design style saw a return in Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring.
Look at that.
It's a little thing that I have grown to deeply appreciate.
And whilst we're looking at the levels, I do want to say, one thing I do think Dark Souls 2 does over Dark Souls 3 is just the aesthetics. I think that the whole Ash setting in Dark Souls 3, it makes sense lore-wise, but I just don't like it. I think it makes the areas look very desaturated, just not very pleasant to look at. Dark Souls 2, on the other hand, the colour palette is much better. The areas themselves, hit or miss, but the actual aesthetics are much better than Dark Souls 3.
I have also come to appreciate the story of Dark Souls 2 as time has gone on. Many people believe it to be the worst in the series, and while I can understand that belief, I don't think worst is the best way of putting it. It is definitely the least tied together with the other games. The story is rather vague about the cycle of light and dark, and is vague about other things too, unless you are prepared to really dig deep to learn the story of Dark Souls 2.
Yeah.
If I had to give the story a more correct description, I would say it is the most detached of the 3 games. It is weak when held up to the other games.
Like, I think Dark Souls 2's story is similar to the others in a sense that you won't really understand it unless you delve deeply into it. But yeah, I think Dark Souls 2's story is very vague in comparison. And I don't think it's nearly as iconic as, like, Dark Souls 1's or Dark Souls 3's story.
But alone, it is still a marvel of storytelling. Unlike the other Dark Souls titles, Dark Souls 2 takes place in an unrecognizable kingdom, far away from the First Flame, or so it seems. Drangleic is commonly believed to be located far from the kiln of the First Flame in Lordran, but it is also hinted that by the time this game takes place, Lordran has already fallen to ruin, lost to time completely, with its lands being occupied by new peoples, the land also having taken up new form. Knowing this, Dark Souls 2 likely takes place in between the events of the first and third games. So, there are some spoilers ahead for the game, but not like that really matters. But if you wish to play the game blind without knowing things beforehand, then skip to this timestamp on screen.
Yeah, to be fair, I think I am going to skip ahead just so I don't, you know, spoil the story or anything. But I think that Dark Souls 2's story, I wouldn't consider it bad. But again, I think it just... I think it's because Dark Souls 1's story was just so iconic. Like, Dark Souls 2's chances of success, and you got to keep in mind that the lead staff members were not present for Dark Souls 2's development. Like, the lead graphic designer, project manager, and, you know, I can't remember the 3 roles, but, like, you'll know this if you've done research into it. Like, the main staff members went to work on Bloodborne, and basically whoever was left, or the B team, as, you know, it's been heard of before, was left to make Dark Souls 2. So, like, with these roadblocks in mind, there was no way that Dark Souls 2 could become as iconic or as well made as the first game. But I would never consider the story to be bad.
And its connections to the game's DLCs is one of the most unique I've seen in the series so far. Dark Souls 2 takes its own concepts fairly seriously. The depth of the game has kept me interested in it even years after my first playthrough. Again, this also somewhat falls apart in Scholar, with some mechanics changing slightly that don't make sense in the wider sense of gameplay. But along the terms of its story and its focus on that story, the change...
Yeah, I think Fragrant Branches of Yore and Pharos Lockstones, I think Elden Ring did them better. Because, like, even though Pharos Lockstones, they would affect the area in some regard, Elden Ring would literally allow you to explore new areas or new boss fights. And every single one would give you something good, you know, or something worthwhile your time. So it's kind of like, which one do you prefer? I personally prefer Stone Sword Keys. I think that the Elden Ring's way of doing it was better, but I can understand why you would choose Pharos Lockstones. It wasn't a good idea, but they executed it the best way they could.
Versions doesn't matter at all. Just about everything in Dark Souls 2 has a connection. Some bosses are tied together, as are some NPCs.
Yeah, like, it's actually quite cool, the, where is it? The lore between these two. The lore is quite nice, but what I don't like is, again, it kind of breaks immersion when you realize that Velstadt, this guy with the massive hammer, won over Rame, the Fume Knight. Like, Velstadt triumphed over Rame, yet when you fight them, Rame is infinitely more difficult than Velstadt. Infinitely. Like, this motherfucker is slow as shit. And yeah, he has pretty powerful dark attacks in his second phase, but this motherfucker's got, like, really OP fire attacks. And he's way faster. So, like, yes, the lore between them is nice, and it makes sense that, like, this guy won over Rame, so he's, like, got the task of defending the king, whereas Rame was banished. But when you fight them, it breaks the immersion, because you're like, okay, this guy's weak as fuck, how did he win against this guy?
NPCs. This is true even in the DLCs, the DLCs themselves being more of an extension of Vendrick's story, showing the events that occurred in other kingdoms where a queen entered and a kingdom fell. Well, in all except for one. In that DLC, the Crown of the Old Iron King, the kingdom had already fallen to ruin, so the queen that would have been simply set up shop there, waiting for someone to arrive and take that power.
Yeah.
If you do not plan on playing the game, but are still interested in the story, then I strongly suggest looking up explanations of the story on YouTube. There are many great videos by VaatiVidya on the game, and each go into incredible detail on the story.
Like, holy fuck, the amount of videos that go into, like, Dark Souls 2's story, as well as, like, Dark Souls, like, not even just Dark Souls 2, like, the other games as well. The stories of these games are immensely complicated. And I think that if you put in the time and research, I think that you'd be satisfied.
Vaati's videos are all exceptionally well made, and I recommend his content to anyone who is looking for a little more about the FromSoft series.
Yeah. Like, if you want to learn more about the story, just watch videos on them. If you want to, like, if you're desperate for more story, because the way that they're broken down is very good.
To end off, I would like to briefly mention some extra things that I personally enjoy about Dark Souls 2. These aspects of the game are highly subjective, and some of you may think these things differently from me. So just remember that this is simply my opinion. If you disagree or have more to add, then feel free to leave those thoughts in the comments. I'll be happy to read them.
Let's see what he has to say.
Starting off, life gems have had a bit of a rocky standing among the players of Dark Souls 2. When I first played the game, I actually hated them. To me, they felt like a cheap way to up the difficulty. After my first playthrough though, I came to really enjoy life gems. They gave me a backup option just in case I lost all my Estus, or
I think life gems were a good idea, but the way it was executed was poor. Like, the idea of having, like, a slow healing item as, like, a substitute for your main healing item, that being the Estus Flask, I think that was a good idea, but look at it. You can have 97 of them, and they're cheap as fuck. Like, you literally have to go through the starting area, talk to the merchant, make her return to Majula, and bam, you've got an infinite supply of life gems. And they cost 300 souls each. Like, they're cheap as chips. You can have, like, 99 healing items, which I don't think is a good idea. I think how pellets worked in Sekiro was much better. Where, like, yeah, you didn't have nearly as much, however, they would renew just like your Estus Flask whenever you were at the equivalent of bonfires in that game.
or if I got hurt on the way to a boss and needed to pick me up but didn't want to use an Estus. Life gems for me have stayed the same since then. As a backup option, they aren't too bad. I understand that having an infinite supply of them early on can hurt some people's opinion on them, and that is a criticism I do share about them, but overall, I'm quite fond of these little gems.
Like, they definitely make the game easier. Like, it's the reason why I think Dark Souls 2 is, like, the easiest is because of how many fucking healing items you have. Like, and there's different versions of life gems as well. Like, you have Radiant ones, you have Old Radiant, you have Elizabeth Mushrooms, you have Divine Blessings, you have like Crimson Water. You have so many fucking healing items in Dark Souls 2. It's ridiculous.
Speaking of life gems, there is a larger focus on the consumables in Dark Souls 2. A lot of them are versatile and fun to use.
Yeah,
especially the magic build, as many of them help magic builds to be more viable. Dark Souls 2 also gave us the first instance of respecking our stats. This is done
that is true.
Vessel at the first Firekeeper you spoke to when you created your character. It just seems like there is a lot more at your disposal in Dark Souls 2, and I didn't feel this way about consumables again until Elden Ring. Now,
that is a good point. In all honesty, that is a fantastic point. The consumables in Bloodborne, I think, were good, but just not. And in Dark Souls 3, you barely ever used them other than, like, pine resins. But, like, I do agree with that point. That is a very good point. The consumables in Dark Souls 2 were, like, the most I've ever used them until Elden Ring came out. And even then, I think I still used them more in Dark Souls 2.
To this game, and while I won't ignore them, I'm not going to go super in-depth about them, but I will mention two specific ones briefly. Those two being adaptability and animation timing.
Okay.
Adaptability being a level that improves how well you do different things, like dodge and drink Estus for some reason. This stat hurts balancing and is why many of the janky hitboxes in Dark Souls 2 exist, as many can be avoided, but only with high adaptability. Now for animation timing...
Yeah, like the adaptability was such a bad idea. Because in Dark Souls 1, in the previous reaction video, you'll have heard me talk about this. In Dark Souls 1, you got... the amount of invincibility frames you had when dodging would go up the less equipment you had. So essentially, if you had, like, fuck all armor, the trade-off would be that you were faster and you had more time being invincible for every roll, which made rolls generally better as a result. Whereas if you had heavier armor, you would roll slower and you'd have less iframes. Whereas in Dark Souls 2, yes, the amount of equipment you had would increase how fast or slow you were, but it wouldn't affect your iframes. Meaning that you could be like Usain fucking Bolt with your roll, and you could roll across the entire length of the room, but because you have such little time invincible, if you've not leveled up adaptability, you'll still take damage even though you're nowhere near the damage source. I think adaptability was such a bad idea. I do like the other things it does, such as increasing poison defense. I think that's quite good, but tying invincibility frames to adaptability was a bad idea.
Timing in this game is actually quite slow. You have to wait for your animations to end before you can begin another one. This hurts survivability and leads to what is known as turn-based Dark Souls. It slows the gameplay down, which, for a game series that focuses heavily on its combat, is just horrible.
And I think Dark Souls 1 and Demon Souls are guilty of this to an extent, but I think Dark Souls 2 does it way worse.
Lenny talks about these two negatives in his video and goes far more into them than I just did. I will leave the link to his video on Dark Souls 2 in the description below.
Okay.
So go check that out if you want to hear more about the game.
Maybe I'll check that video out another time.
There is something that Lenny also talks about in his video, something that he calls the most important part. To him, and to me, the most important thing about Dark Souls 2 is that none of the negatives matter if you actually like the game. If you enjoy Dark Souls 2, even with all of its issues, that doesn't matter if you genuinely enjoy the experience.
I think, to an extent, he's right, although I think that that could lead to rose-tinted glasses, and you just being in denial towards the objective flaws that the game has. So, I agree, if you like the game despite those flaws, I think that's fine, as long as you acknowledge the flaws. If you say that you like Dark Souls 2 and that it has no flaws whatsoever, that's complete bullshit. But if you like the game despite its flaws and you can work around them, who am I to disagree?
While I can't say the negatives of Dark Souls 2 can be ignored, they definitely can be embraced. I have my issues with the game, but I enjoy many of the aspects, so I choose to embrace
Man, look at this tiny looking dude. Literally every single time you find this guy, he's massive. Yet when you find him in Dragon Shrine for some reason, this ballsack looking dude is just small.
Negatives that I must understand are part
Mini Aldia.
Something that I must overcome in order to see the game's positives for themselves. It is something that I'm glad I've done, as it has allowed me to gain a new perspective on the game, one that I'm sure is available for many of the people who have played Dark Souls 2. I hope that this video has encouraged some of you to play Dark Souls 2, either for the first time or for another playthrough. This game truly does get more flack than it really deserves, and
I agree to an extent. However, I think, once again, I think most of the flack is deserved.
I'd like for more people to play it and gain an opinion on it for themselves. It sucks knowing people intentionally ignore it simply because of the things they hear about it. With many of the people who are trying the Souls games out because of Elden Ring.
I love how he's like a zombie, but he has flawless fucking facial hair. I like that.
It seems like a good time to give Dark Souls 2 some attention. Hopefully it will eventually get seen more positively among the community, and if not, then oh well. Dark Souls 2...
Yeah, I think that Dark Souls 2, over time, that's already happened. I think that the game, over time, has already seen a much more positive growth from the community. I think that before, when it came out, everyone agreed that it was the worst one. But now people are making, at the start of the video, he showed this, where it was, more and more people making, in defense of Dark Souls 2. Where is it?
Whole thing in the world, especially...
Yeah, more and more people. I get that these videos are quite old at this point. But, more and more people are making, in defense of Dark Souls 2. So, I think Dark Souls 2, people are already liking it more than they did at launch. However, I don't think there's any denying that it's still a pretty poor Souls game. I think that, yes, if you were to embrace its design issues, that's fair enough. I'm not going to stop you. And it's your decision at the end of the day. But I think that this game just has too many fucking flaws that the other games don't have. With the other games, yeah, they're flawed in other regards, but at the very least, I never had to level up a stat just to make it so that rolls were a viable option. I didn't have to do that. The games were clever in the way that they did that. They were oh, if you have, a heavy amount of gear, maybe try blocking, as rolling won't work for you. Oh, you have a fuck-all amount of armor? That's fine, you can try roll. Don't block, though, because the slightest flick and your poise will be broken. So, I think the other games were better in that regard. They weren't perfect, but I think Dark Souls 2 had the most amount of issues, which is why I think it's the worst Souls game.